The study design, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, will often determine the method or the way that you collect data for your research. Some methods of data collection really restrict the type and the nature of the data that's collected. And of course, because these are really tight and specific, these are favored by quantitative studies, that exact information that you want in a quantitative study. Other methods are more flexible and often kind of formulate and develop during the study, and actually even like interviews, questions pop up during the interview. So these, of course, are more open-ended and more focused on finding out why instead of what. So these are more favored by qualitative studies. There are two ways or two approaches to getting data. You can get primary data from primary sources, and this is basically just information that is gotten directly from a participant's or subjects of a study, or through the observation of the study subjects by the researcher. Then you have secondary data, which is from secondary sources. And that's information that's been used previously or developed by another study, or is in a governmental database, or maybe records from a business. But it's data that you didn't create or discover, you're just reusing it. First, we're going to talk about some primary sources where you can get data, or how you can get data. So one of the primary ways you can get data is through observation, what you see. This is basically just watching and listening to an interaction or a phenomenon. And when you're doing that, you're more interested in the subject's behaviors than what they perceive or what they believe. You want to find out about, maybe you want to find out about how viewers react to a particular animation. Just watch them as they watch the animation. And then as a researcher, you record, you'd write down those reactions. There are two types of observation. First, there's participant observation, and that's just when the researcher themselves is a participant in a group, in the activities of a group, as a member of the group. So for example, if you decided you were going to observe your classmates' reaction in a class that you were enrolled in, to maybe their reaction to a particular subject, you would be doing that as a participant, as a member of that group. So that would be a participant observation. Now, there's also non-participant observation, and that's when the researcher doesn't get involved with the subjects. They're just objective, they're an observer. And so that would be if you decided, well, I observed my class, I'm going to go observe another class that I'm not a participant of, not a member of. And so in that instance, you would just observe. You wouldn't participate at all. There are some problems that can pop up when data is being collected through observation. The first one is the Hawthorne effect, and that's just when people are being observed, they know they're being observed, they often change their behavior. So you may not actually get realistic and true data. Another one is observer bias. You, as the observer, might have a bias. You might already have an idea in your head, so you might interpret what you see incorrectly. Another one could be incomplete data, and that just means the observation recording or notes may not include all the pertinent data. I mean, the observer may leave some things out in their notes. And then varied interpretations. If you have multiple observers, they may see and probably will see things differently. So that also can cause problems in your data. Observations can be recorded in two ways. They can be recorded in narrative a narrative manner, or on a form using scales. In the narrative technique, the researcher basically just sits and takes notes on what he or she is seeing. And then later uses those notes to write up a narrative form, which is basically like a story form, right? Another way you can do it is to, instead of writing down notes, use a pre-made form for each participant that you're observing, and then use that form to check things that you see. So the researcher in that case prepares that scale or scales on a form that they can rate in different categories and certain aspects of those categories of what they're seeing. The problem with that one is that it's very prescribed and there's not a lot of detail taken down unless the researcher also jots down notes while they're checking off boxes on their forms. The next primary source that we're going to talk about are interviews. And interviews are commonly used in research to collect information from people. And in research, it's also used to collect information for a specific purpose, a research purpose. So there's a couple of different types of interviews. One of the type is that in which a researcher has a lot of freedom and a flexibility about the questions, how to word the questions, and actually being able to come up with new questions that occur to them during the interview and being able to ask those. Those types of interviews are called unstructured interviews. So it's sort of just kind of what happens, and the information gets recorded. The other type are more inflexible, and this is where the researcher has a list of research questions and they follow those questions and they don't deviate from that list. So they get very specific information. If they interview more than one person, they are able to easily correlate each of the interviews together. These kind of interviews are called structured interviews. There are also advantages and disadvantages to interviews. So interviews are more appropriate for complex situations. They provide better in-depth information from the respondents. The information can be supplemented, so if the interviewer can ask additional questions if they want more information about something. Questions can be explained as to what the meaning of those questions are, and it can be used for a wider population. So if anybody can really be interviewed, as opposed to like a written survey, which if the people can't read, they can't take the survey. The disadvantage of interviews is that they're very time consuming and very expensive. And the quality of the data depends on the quality of the interviewer and the quality of the interview. It also, the quality of the data can vary based on if multiple interviewers are used. And then again, there's a possibility of researcher bias. Another way to gather primary data is through surveys or questionnaires, as our textbook calls them. This is simply a written list of questions, and the responses are recorded by the participant themselves. And one of the problems with this is that there's no one there to explain the meaning of the questions or to clarify the questions. So it's a good idea to write these in sort of an interactive style so that the participants feel like someone is asking them these questions directly. And when there's complicated questions, it's a very good idea to add a preface or some kind of explanation that explains why that question is important and why it's being asked. There are a lot of different ways to distribute or administer your survey. You can mail them, which is still used a lot, but not as often these days. You can use a collective administration process, which just means you have a captive audience, like kids in a schoolroom or, employees in a department, that kind of thing. You can do an online survey, and that's really the most used these days. And then finally, you can administer it in a public place, like in front of a post office or at a store and so on. And that's just people who happen to be in the vicinity of that location, that public place, take the survey. There are some pluses and minuses to surveys. The pluses are big. It's less expensive to administer a survey, period. There's also a greater sense of being anonymous for the participants, which is also, big because of privacy issues. There are lots of disadvantages. You're limited in who you get to take your survey. Very often, even if you send out a lot of surveys, you don't get a lot back. That's a low response rate. People decide if they want to take the survey or not. That is a selecting bias. They might be interested in the topic or really unhappy about the topic, and that may influence them. The researchers can't clarify the questions, as we talked about. There's no opportunity for spontaneous answers on a survey. The answers of some questions can be influenced by answers of another question, as well as people around the people taking the survey can be influencing what is answered on the survey. And then finally, the answers that people give can't be supplemented with other information. There's no opportunity on a survey for them to give extra information. When you have a survey, you must include a cover letter or an introduction. This is just to explain who you are, what you're doing, why you're giving them this survey and asking them to do it, or interview or observation, whatever you're doing. I like to say, think of it as an elevator pitch for your survey or your interview or your observation. You also have to get consent from them, so that's a part of it as well. There's specific things that you need to do in your introductions, your cover letters. You should introduce yourself and your university. So example would be, my name is Julie Karn and I'm working on a master's degree at Arizona State University. So you talk to you say who you are and where you're from and also what you're doing. You're working on a master's degree. Then you need to also describe the main objective of the study that you're doing. So example would be, I am studying the effects of social media on the return on investment for car dealerships. Next, you would want to explain the relevance of the study. Why is it important? Who cares, right? What's the big deal about it? Well, my example would be, the results of the study could help car dealerships with their social media campaigns. You would then also give basic directions. Please complete the following survey. And then the next few are really important. So explain that the study is voluntary. Okay, so a statement like, this study is completely voluntary and you have the right to not take the survey or stop taking the survey at any time. You would also explain that the survey is anonymous, if it is anonymous, although sometimes you may have non-anonymous ones, and that's a little more complicated, but mostly we do anonymous. And so you just want to put a statement in there that says that your responses are completely anonymous. You need to provide contact information in case they have questions about things on the survey or about the study itself. So you say something like, you may contact me and you give an email if you have any questions about the study or the survey. Give a deadline for the survey of when you want it to, that you'd like to get the responses back to, with just a line, please respond by whatever date. And then be sure to thank them for participating in your study by just putting a line in there. Thank you for participating in my study by completing the survey. All those things need to come if you're doing a survey, you can put them in the header of the survey. If you're doing an interview, this may be like a script that you write so that you could, if you're talking to people on the phone or face to face, that you can say all these things. But you need to say all these things. You need to have it prepared and ready to go. There are two different styles of questions that can be asked on a survey. The first one is open-ended, and that means that possible responses are not provided in the survey or interview. So you don't give them a list of answers that they can choose from. They give their own. So in a survey, they would write down their own answers in their own words. In an interview, the interviewer writes down the words exactly or records them electronically or may write them in a summary. Right? So those are very narrative based and open-ended. Close-ended is where you give the possible responses on the survey or in the interview. So what day do you like the best? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You give them those options, whether it's in a survey or an interview. In a survey or even an interview, it's always a great idea to include an other option that allows the participant to put in their own answer. There's good and bad things about each of these types of questions. With open-ended questions, you can get in-depth information and the respondents have a chance to expand on their answers. But it's difficult to analyze this kind of data because the researcher has to pull out the important things and then tally the different topics and themes together in a way that makes sense to them. In a closed question, the disadvantage is you don't get a lot of that depth to the information. There may be researcher bias because the researcher provides the answers to the respondent rather than the respondent giving their own answers. And very often people will click through surveys or quickly answer interview questions where the answer is provided without really thinking about it. However, because these are already pre-categorized, it's much easier and faster to analyze data from closed questions. It's important to make good questions for your survey to get good data or interview questions. So here's some pointers. Use everyday language. That means if you're using lingo or jargon that isn't commonly known, be sure to explain it. So here's an example across from that. The first example, do you believe the semantic web concept best defines how the web works? Well, if you don't know what semantic web means, you won't be able to answer that question. Right? So you would want to define that. Don't ask ambiguous questions. Make sure that there are answers that apply to everyone. So, do you attend class regularly? Yes or no? Well, you might want to say sometimes I do, or it depends. But if you didn't give me that answer, and I don't always go, but I go a lot, pretty much regular, I miss every once in a while, I don't have an answer, right? Don't ask very wide-reaching, open-ended questions with like, are you happy with your classes? Well, you might be happy with some, but not others. And you might get a lot of really wacky answers to that. Don't ask double-barreled questions within questions, like how often and how long have you used Adobe InDesign? That's two questions, how often and how long. Okay, so you're gonna need don't do that because that actually garbles up your data. Don't ask questions that lead your respondents to a particular answer. Right? So don't ask something like Adobe applications are too expensive, correct? So that implies that the researcher believes yes, Adobe applications are too expensive, and that's a leading question. Don't ask questions based on presumptions, right? So these questions assume a behavior or a fact about the respondents, like asking how many classes did you skip last month? Well, that assumes this respondent skipped a class. There's a joke, how many times did you beat your wife last month? Right? That assumes that person beats their wife. You can't assume, and you don't want to imply any of that in your questioning. Now let's talk about creating the actual data collection instrument, basically survey. We're going to talk about surveys. You need to make sure that when you create your survey, or interview questions even, that you create those questions to directly answer one or more of your research objectives, or if you wrote research questions, to address those research questions. So the first thing you got to do is go back and look at those research objectives or questions that you wrote when you were developing your study, and make sure those are clear and on point and correct for what you want to find out. And then for each of those objectives, you should list questions that will answer those objectives. And then for each of those questions, list the information that you need that will answer those questions. And then you can formulate the actual survey or interview questions to get that information that you need to answer or address your research questions or objectives. If this is a little bit confusing, you can go and look in the book. Kumar has a good little explanation about this on page 188 and 189. Now here's a little example of how you might construct construct a survey about a particular thing. So say you wanted to find out about GIT students and their preference for current movie superheroes. There's a big thing going on now. We got the Marvel superheroes, we got the DC Comics superheroes. So I think that's always something that at least the undergrad students are always really interested in. So the first thing I'd want to do is find out some information about my participants. And you probably are always going to want to do that no matter what you're studying. You want to find out about the people who are giving you the answers. Unless you know specifically, like you're surveying the entire population, like everyone in a classroom. But even then, I think it's a good thing to do. So we'd ask some demographic questions, such as, are you a GIT student? And the answers are yes and no, and you're like, well, why is other? Because a lot of students that aren't in the GIT program take GIT classes. Like we have business students, we have graphic designs from the Herberger Design College, those kind of things, right? So you always want to give them an other with an open field where they can type it in. And then I'd ask how old they were. And so I'm going to explain why I've divided the ages up into these groups. Now you can just have an open-ended thing, but you're going to get a bazillion different answers, and then you're going to have to correlate them, and it just really sometimes is not worth it. So I have, as my first answer, under 18. Because if they're under 18, I'm probably not going to want to include them in my survey results, because if I do through the university, and this is any university, I would have to then go through the internal review board process of getting approval to do a survey with people who are underage or under the age of 18. Okay, so I always have that as my first one, because I know anybody that answers that, I'm going to throw their data out. I'm not going to use it. And then because I want to find out about college students, the next logical group to me are typical college age students, which are ages from 18 to 22. And so I would have 18 to 22. And because my previous one was under 18, so those don't overlap. You want to make sure your groups don't overlap on your ages. And so then my next group would be not 22 to 29, but 23 to 29, because you don't want to have any groups that someone could say, well, I'm 22. Am I supposed to be in group B or group C? So my next group would be, and then I'm just cutting it off by decades at that point. So 23 to 29, 30 to 39, I could do 40 to 49, 50 to 59, so on. And then at some point you would just say over whatever the last, the next number after the last group that you picked. So here we have under 18, 18 to 22, 23 to 29, 30 to 39, and over 40. Next, I probably want to ask if they are fans of superhero comics. Like, I would want to know for a couple of reasons. I might want to weed out anybody that says, no, I don't really care about superheroes at all. Maybe I don't want to include them in my data. I might still, but I might not want to include them in my data. That may not be pertinent to what I want to find out. So I would ask a question: are you a fan of any comic superheroes? And then I would have yes, no, and other. And in the other, you may get, well, I'm not really sure if this character is a superhero or considered a superhero, but I like, so and so. Then I would ask about the two factions as I see it, the DC Comics and Marvel Comics faction, and which one of those that they prefer, because I find that most students prefer one over the other. So I would ask that question: do you prefer DC Comics, Marvel Comics, or other? Because there are other ones, and I would want to make sure that those got included in the survey. Next, I think I would want to find out which of the superheroes do they like the most, and then allow them to check more than one, or as many as they want, or limit them, say, check up to 3 or check up to 5 or whatever. And then I would list as the options to answer as many of these superheroes, probably the main superheroes in Marvel and the main superheroes in DC Comics. And then I would, of course, the last one option would be the other, and let them fill it in. And then I would then ask, which one is your favorite, and make them give basically the same exact answer options as the previous questions, but on this one they would only be able to choose one. And again, I would end that with the other answer option. So we've asked some quantitative style questions. We've asked the question and we've given them specific answers for them to choose from. So we've got specific answers. And so we know what our students prefer as far as superheroes, but we don't know why they like what they like. So this would be a good time to ask some more sort of qualitative style questions, open-ended questions, where they can answer a little bit more in their own words. So we could ask questions like, what characteristics do you admire most about your favorite superhero? And why do you prefer your favorite superhero? And because in surveys we do often ask both types of styles, I like to think of those kinds of surveys and those kinds of interviews as mixed method, because they're using both that quantitative style closed question and the qualitative style open-ended question. Here's some other concerns that you should pay attention to when you're making an instrument, a survey or interview list of questions. The order of questions is important. You want to make sure that you're not creating bias in the questions. I usually put the demographic questions at the beginning. You should pre-test your research instrument or your survey, your list of questions, and have somebody go through them and find out if there's anything that they don't understand. They need to be able to understand the questions, so that's what a pre-test is for. You also need to make sure that you write your questions in a way that the participants or respondents will be motivated to answer the questions and motivated to share their information. So that's important in the way that you write them. The respondents that you're asking a question of need to have that information. So you wouldn't want to ask, an 80-year-old woman what the current #1 hip hop song is, right? Because that's not information she's likely to have. So make sure that you're asking the right questions of the right participants. And then finally, number your surveys questions, because you have to refer back to those questions when you write up your research, and it's so much easier to do if the items are numbered when in the actual survey. But no matter what you put in your survey, just make sure that other than the demographic questions that you ask, that each question you do ask applies to one or more of your research objectives or your research questions for your study. We just finished talking about getting primary data directly from the participants. Let's talk about secondary sources now. Secondary sources are data that is collected by others or by you for another purpose. Maybe you did a study previous and you want to use the same data to show something else or to find out something else, or you want to use data that was gathered by another organization. You can do that. That's secondary sources. So here's some examples. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time reading all the way through these, but government databases, like pretty much there are thousands and thousands of different governmental databases, like the federal census. Data.gov is a great site for getting a lot of different types of data that you might use. You might get data that was gathered in previous research studies on a topic that is similar to the topic that you're researching on. You might get data from personal records, people's diaries, their journals, that kind of thing. From mass media, such as newspapers or magazines. For GIT, some of the good sources for secondary information is the Pew Research Center. They have all kinds of sort of media and popular topics and data for those things, all kinds of stuff. So you should check that out. Also, ACM, which is Association for Computing Machinery, they have some special interest groups which are very much related to GIT topics. And you can get those through the ASU library, and as well as IEEE, IEEE, and I can't remember exactly. It's International something of Engineering, something. But it's also in the ASU library. There are some problems you might encounter with secondary sources. The first is validity. Some sources will be more reliable than other sources. So make sure that wherever you're getting that secondary data from, it is a legit and viable source of data. Data that's been published in articles in established journals, academic journals, medical journals, that kind of thing, are usually pretty good. Governmental databases are usually pretty good, university databases and that sort of thing. Somebody on Wikipedia, probably not a good, reliable source. You don't know when you are using other people's data if they were objective or if they had personal bias, so you just have to be careful of that. The data that you really want may not be available, so you may not be able to use a secondary source. And then the format that you need the data in may not match up with what is available, so you might have to spend a lot of time making it fit your needs. The bottom line is data collection is key to all research, whether it's through observation or interviews or surveys. It is the thing that creates information that you use to decide one thing against another, or find out about a certain subject or a certain process. You have to be able to collect data, and to do that you have to have good data collection instruments. So good surveys with well-written questions, good interview questions. You know, if you're doing something like a usability test, a good process for that usability test. It's all important, and it's again key to research.